Okie dokie. So I'm gonna spend just a couple minutes kind of reminding everybody what's going on at the end of the semester here. So I'm just gonna sign into Blackboard. I'll go ahead and share it for folks on Zoom. Alrighty. Okay. So here's what we have coming up due. Today we're gonna do our last lecture, finish personality disorders. Your presentations are 1 week from today at 11:30 in this room. And so make sure you're coordinating with your group, if at all possible, practice it with your group the whole way through. So that y'all know that it fits in the time and that you know who's going next to do what. So the other thing to be doing is just turning in anything you haven't turned in throughout the semester. So if you need to finish up the clinical choices or the other things on Launchpad, do that. If you haven't done exam 3 yet, do that. You've got until next Tuesday to do exam 4. Do have it done by the time of our presentations, because particularly for those of you who are seniors, I've got to have your grades in by Thursday morning. So I'm just gonna like go home and grade and get those in. Questions about anything coming due or about the presentations? This shouldn't surprise me. Y'all have been with it all semester. Awesome. But just wanted to kind of touch base and remind everybody of everything coming up. Alrighty, so today we're going to finish personality disorders, and I did find us some more videos to put throughout to try to illustrate some of these. So I'm gonna hide my captions so we can use the good ones here. And go ahead and play this. So I found a couple different videos of people who identify as having antisocial PD or blatantly as psychopaths. And this is the first one of them.
What are some things you've done as a result of your psychopathy?
Sometimes when I think about these stories, these guilt stories, I don't know what people would feel guilt about. So I do have a little bit of mind blindness there, you know, like I've never lived the life of somebody who feels this empathy, this guilt way. And so I don't know what might trigger it. I've never have really felt anything for animals. You know, I've never had a pet or ever felt like a connection to animals. I've never like tortured animals. I know, you know, some psychopaths do for various reasons. You know, I never was one of those that tortured animals. But one time I was teaching swimming lessons. I went out, I saw there was this baby opossum. It was like this big, you know, just like struggling to try to get out of the pool. And I thought, oh, baby opossum must have fallen in the pool in the night or in the early morning. And now he's trying to get out. But I also thought, you know, opossum is a pest. I don't want this opossum around me. If I fish him out, then who knows what he's gonna do. You know, even like domesticated animals can kind of turn on you, especially when they feel like they're kind of in that fight or flight kind of moment. So I was like, I'll just drown the opossum. What I did is just got a hose and just kept like hosing him. So he's trying to like get up and I'm just like trying to drown him with the hose. And I do that for like 5 minutes. And he's actually a trooper, this baby opossum. And so I thought, this is not working. I will just cancel the swimming lesson and just go off and do something else, you know, go to the beach for that afternoon. I think maybe that seems cold-hearted to people, the way I went about it. But that's just kind of, and that's kind of an interesting thing too. We're socialized to think different things are cold-hearted. And I guess I just am immune to socialization in general, most socialization. So one kind of example that stands out to me is I was living in Los Angeles, and it was like a 12.
All right, so you get a little bit of a vibe from that. Hopefully the other ones, the sound will be better. I don't know what the heck's going on with the speaker. This one's certainly at least a little better.
How you doing?
Pretty good.
Okay, that's good.
What's your name?
Greg.
All right, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
What age were you diagnosed?
I think I was around 21, 22.
How old are you?
I am 30.
This is someone who's diagnosed with antisocial PD. So again, I'm just trying to muck with the sound and get it better in any way, shape, or form here. I'm not holding my breath, but it's possible that I could. Gotta love when stuff breaks right at the end of the semester. Okay. Settings. There we go. Maybe not. Yeah, cool. They don't even let me adjust things. I'm so glad. All right. We won't watch too much of the videos, but I want to give you guys a little bit of a flavor of it at
Great.
least. So.
What's your definition of a sociopath?
A sociopath to me is someone who has no regard for themselves or for other people. You're very impulsive, very irresponsible, reckless, basically like a child.
Were you surprised when you got diagnosed?
I don't think surprised is the right word. I think relieved. Like I had felt out of control and I didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing for a long time. So knowing that there was an actual reason behind why I was doing these things, it was really like kind of freeing in a way.
What made you think you was a sociopath?
Waking up in prison was probably my first clue.
Do you mind me asking what led you to go to prison?
I've committed several crimes. I was using drugs and selling to support my habit. I also have many like retail thefts.
How long ago did you commit?
So if you guys want to watch more of that later on your own devices that hopefully have much more functional sound, feel free. It was pretty interesting. Okay, and so we talked about this a little bit in passing last time, but essentially therapy doesn't work for these folks. Therapy is just, you have to want to change for therapy to help. And oftentimes people who are psychopaths and sociopaths don't want to change. So unfortunately, their lack of conscience, their lack of ability to learn will cause issues. They're often mandated to treatment, so that makes it even tougher. And again, some cognitive therapists will try to guide the clients to think about moral issues and the needs of other people. But that doesn't always work, and group therapy is like the worst idea. All right, so this is a little one about brain.
Of all the violent offenders in our prisons, about 1/4 are psychopaths. Many of their crimes are well known and abhorred. It's already known that the brain.
I'm gonna try something. It probably won't do squat, but I'm at least gonna try it.
Brains of psychopaths are built differently. Sections associated with behavior and emotion are actually smaller than those of the general population. It may explain the personality of the psychopath.
They're callous, unemotional, they're interpersonally manipulative, and they use aggression in a slightly different way, what we call instrumental aggression. So a cold, premeditated, planned use of aggression to get what they want.
Dr. Nigel Blackwood and his U.S.-Canadian team tested how the behavior and emotion parts of the brain respond to a simple reward-punishment game. Volunteers included psychopathic violent offenders, non-psychopathic violent offenders, and a control group, all white British men who were tested while in an MRI machine. They had to choose one of two images on a screen. The right picture resulted in reward points. The wrong choice results in point loss. Then right and wrong are switched. Everyone figures it out, but in those brief moments of losing points, punishment, the scans show the psychopathic brain behaves unusually, processes punishment differently from violent offenders and people with no history of crime.
They're not simply insensitive to punishment, there's a very different organization of their reinforcement learning system that shapes their behavior.
This person's eyes might go like that.
Criminal psychologists have long tried to understand why psychopaths are beyond reform. They don't benefit from rehabilitation the way other violent offenders can. This new research could lead to new interventions at a young age.
There may be ways that we can actually work with individuals, perhaps at a youth level, to have them to have some sort of motivation around their behavior when it comes to things like punishment and reward.
The new research adds to growing evidence that psychopathy is not just a behavioral problem, but a complex neurological mystery.
And so I've put that here to just sort of explain why it's hard to treat them, right? You're dealing with people whose brains operate completely differently. So again, we won't watch the whole thing for this lady, but she's going to talk briefly about why she decided to get some treatment.
Why did you decide to get treatment?
So I would say that to find somebody professional to help you is the best thing that you could do. I think the reason why I started thinking I needed help is because I realized that I did not have an alternative to manipulating. The only way that I understood how to interact with people was through manipulation. I didn't even know how not to manipulate people in my relationships, and that eventually kind of just always led to them having issues, you know, and then having these breakups. It wasn't until much later that I started taking it more seriously. It was after like 5 or 6 years. I had, had some problems with my employment. I had some problems with various relationships, friends that like broke up with me, other relationships that broke up with me, problems with my family. And I thought, there's a little bit of a pattern to this. Every 3 years or so, my life kind of just falls apart, and then I just, reinvent myself, go to law school, start a new job, do whatever it was. But I thought, I'm getting in my late 20s now, and at this rate, I'm going to run out of career options, and so this isn't going to work out for me. And so I remembered, several, the 5 years before, what I had thought about sociopath, and I thought this time I will actually look into it and see what I can make of it, see if it will.
So it's really interesting because she really illustrates that people with psychopathy kind of don't suffer from their disorder until they realize it's affecting other parts of their lives, right? So until they realize like, oh, I can't get a job. Oh, like I can't hold relationships with people. And so that's what drove her to seek out some therapy. So borderline personality disorder is actually the personality disorder I worked with the most when I was doing clinical work. It has a high comorbidity with eating disorders. It also has a high comorbidity with PTSD. So because I was treating both those populations, I saw a lot of this. And so the symptoms here are instability of self-image and relationships. Sometimes this is described as identity diffusion or identity disturbance. They have trouble being alone, but also have difficulty being with others. They'll search for faulty saviors. One of the hallmarks of these folks is that they'll put you on a pedestal one day and the next day you're trash. And that could be your significant other, that could be your therapist, right? It could be anyone you're interacting with. They therefore end up with a history of intense but unstable, tumultuous relationships. And this ends in exploitation and vicious cycles. They have emotional dysphoria and instability. This also has a high comorbidity with bipolar disorder. They have a baseline of dysphoria or inner deadness that alternates with sometimes violence and prolonged emotional outbursts. And in particular, they have extreme responses to the idea of being abandoned. They're impulsive, unpredictable, and they engage in sometimes destructive behavior. People with this disorder are prone to bouts of anger, which sometimes result in physical aggression and violence. Just as often, or I would say more often, however, they direct their impulsive anger inward and they engage in what are called self-harm behaviors or parasuicidal behaviors, where they will cut themselves, burn themselves, make suicide attempts, things along those lines. They also engage in alcohol and substance use disorders, reckless behavior, including drunk driving, unsafe sex, other suicidal actions and threats, and binging and purging, even if they don't meet criteria for bulimia, is another way that they self-harm. And so research indicates that as many as 10% of people who seek outpatient therapy and 20% of people who are inpatient hospitalized for psychological reasons may meet the diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder. So this is certainly a severe psychopathology. Many of the clients who come to mental health emergency rooms are individuals with this disorder who have intentionally harmed themselves. And between 1.5 and 2.5% of the general population are thought to suffer from this disorder. Close to 75% of those diagnosed are women. The course of this disorder varies. And the most common patterns, instability and risk of suicide reach a peak during young adulthood and then gradually lessen with advancing age. That being said, when I was treating people with this disorder while I was on my residency, our group was made up almost entirely of women in their 40s and 50s. So it certainly can continue. And so why is it called borderline? It's on the borderline of what? Well, the original idea was that it was on the borderline of neurosis, again, an old world word meaning anxiety, and psychosis. So things like acting out, disturbed relationships, disturbances in your experience of self, and these transient psychotic symptoms play into that. Other people argue that it's on the borderline of being diagnosed with a mood disorder, although some people have both. So about 50% of those with borderline personality disorder will also be diagnosed with either depression or bipolar disorder. It's also perhaps on the border of other personality disorders. So schizotypal shares with it the oddities of thinking, ideas of reference, so thinking everyone is talking about you, depersonalization, emotional chaos, histrionic folks, which we'll talk about next. They also are demanding and attention seeking and express exaggerated emotion, and have a low tolerance for boredom, frustration, and are manipulative. Narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. Similarly, those folks are overwhelmed by criticism and require constant attention and admiration and might have a lack of empathy. And then antisocial, which we just talked about. These folks sometimes do have conduct problems and an unstable history of employment, relationships, changes, and recklessness. And just a little bit of spoiler if you haven't done the clinical choices yet. Our clinical choices for this chapter has borderline PD, and you see her unstable employment history in the case study. All right, so this is just, again, we won't watch the whole thing, but a little bit of a snippet of what it's like to live with this disorder.
This video is not a substitute for medical advice. Talk to your doctor if you're experiencing any of these symptoms. Wonder if she texted me back. Let me check. Why hasn't she texted me back? It's been a whole night. Where is she? Did I do something wrong? Hey, are you mad at me? I'm so sorry. Does she make new friends? Hopefully she responds. Oh my god, it's 8 o'clock. I'm gonna be late for class. Oh my god, I'm so behind in my notes for this class.
Okay, that's the end of the test to review. Make sure to study for your exam tomorrow. It's worth 50%.
50%? I totally forgot. What am I gonna do?
Hey, have you heard about last year's test? I heard it was terrible, like half the class failed. Have you started studying?
No, I haven't.
Oh my god, you could better start studying now, or else you're gonna fail. Like, I already started studying for chapters 1 to 11. It's gonna be a piece of cake for me. Anyways, I gotta go.
Why did she say that? Guess she wants me to fail. I need to start studying for this test right away. I'm gonna fail if I don't. Oh, it's Natasha. Hey, why didn't she say hi? Does she hate me? Oh, I think I heard my phone. I think it's time I told her I have BPD. Borderline personality disorder.
So you can see sort of the overreaction, and how, again, this person acting on their own pathology, telling them like, oh, you better like reach out to this person repeatedly, might actually drive other people away.
I think a lot of people think that people with BPD are looking for attention. We are in so much pain, and this is the way our brains are reacting. It's not on purpose. You're not alone. You're not crazy. There is help out there. There's support in lots of different ways. And I would say that, keep pushing forward. Like, you can do this. You really, really can do this. I
liked that one just because
I think a lot of people,
I think with some of these disorders, and unfortunately you hear this from other psychologists, people believe like, oh, if you have borderline, nothing can be done, you're blah, 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 you can't fix it. And the next person who's going to talk is Marsha Linehan. So Linehan developed the most effective treatment for borderline personality disorder. She also, I believe in the year 2010 or 2011, there was a big New York Times article about her where she disclosed for the first time that the reason she developed this is that she had borderline personality disorder, and she had it in the 70s when they didn't have any effective treatment other than after she self-harmed to lock her in a padded room by herself. You can imagine how effective that would be, right? For someone who already struggles with relationships. So she's going to talk a little bit about stigma with borderline PD.
Borderline personality disorder is by far the most stigmatized disorder. I tell my patients, if you end up in an emergency room for a medical disorder, for God's sakes, do not tell them you meet criteria for borderline personality disorder. Do not tell anybody, because there's such a stigma. And you'll be treated differently most of the time. And many, many, many mental health practitioners will not see a person who meets criteria for borderline personality disorder. Watch TV sometime. They have a mass murder, borderline personality disorder. Drives me nuts.
She's great. I've seen her speak at conferences. I've seen her. My favorite Marsha Linehan interaction I've ever had is she came into a presentation about using her therapy for eating disorders. The tech wasn't working, so she sat there about 2 minutes and she just left. Like, Marsha Linehan does not have time for your bullshit. And fair, like maybe some more of us should act like that. But so we know that there does seem to be a link to previous trauma. Unfortunately, often childhood sexual abuse in people with borderline PD. And some social cultural theorists suggest that cases of borderline PD are particularly likely to emerge in cultures that change rapidly. Now, in terms of treatment, it appears that psychotherapy in general can eventually lead to some degree of improvement. It's not easy, though, for a therapist to strike a balance between empathizing with a patient's dependency and anger and challenging their way of thinking. Furthermore, as you might imagine, termination is often very difficult. So one of my clients that had borderline features, she actually moved several states away She hadn't self-harmed in the entire 6 months I'd been seeing her, called me a couple weeks later and was like, I self-harmed, like almost like, what are you gonna do about it? And it was really hard, right? Because you want to keep helping them, but I had to explain to her, like, your relationship needs to be established with your therapist that's there now, right? And unfortunately, there's nothing I can do to help you. Older versions of your book, I'm not sure, the most recent one, I haven't looked at this in particular, but claimed that contemporary psychodynamic therapy has been somewhat effective. Psychodynamic therapy does not work for these folks the vast majority of the time. So no. Over the past 2, well, now 3 decades actually, Marshall Linehan's integrative treatment approach called dialectical behavioral therapy has received growing research support and is now considered the treatment of choice in most clinical circles for borderline personality disorder. So it includes intensive treatment, and the treatment has 4 modalities. So first off, each patient has an individual therapist, and what you focus on for the first 2 years of treatment, and yes, I said the first 2 years, this is not a short-term therapy, it's just figuring out how to stop the parasuicidal or self-harm behaviors. And a lot of this has to do with like looking back at like, how did the behavior start? Where can we intervene earlier? After those 2 years, then you'll begin to address any underlying trauma, etc. But the idea is until the person is stabilized and has other coping mechanisms, delving into the trauma is probably more harmful than helpful. The second modality is there is a group skills class. It's called just a skills group, but it's more like a class than a therapy group. You teach them skills in mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and also interpersonal relationships. And then the third modality is that they are given the therapist's phone number or pager number, and they are supposed to call before they self-harm. And the idea is it's called phone coaching, and you as the therapist say, what skills have you tried from class? And if they're like, I don't know, I can say, okay, go get your notebook from class. Let's look it over together, see what skills you can try. If they call you after they've already self-harmed, all you can do is assess whether or not they need to go to the hospital to get stitches, basically. So the idea is to intervene before they get to actually self-harming. The fourth modality is that the therapist themselves is supposed to be part of a process or working group of other therapists who are also doing DBT, because this is hard, and being on call 24/7 is emotionally draining. And so to make sure the therapists don't burn out and the therapist has adequate support to support their clients, you're supposed to have this support as well. This is very effective, not only for borderline PD, but also for things like bulimia nervosa, some mood disorders, some alcohol use and other drug use disorders. I think I kind of mentioned everything. Group therapy can be of help, and in particular that skills group that's part of DBT. This is one personality disorder where medications are very helpful. Typically, you're treating the comorbid conditions, but it also can affect and help with the symptoms of borderline PD. So antidepressants, mood stabilizing, anti-anxiety, antipsychotic drugs. The only thing is you have to be very aware of your patient. It's really important for the therapist to collaborate with the psychiatrist. Linehan herself has a rule: no lethal drugs for lethal patients. Don't give someone who has a tendency to try to overdose something that will kill them if they try to overdose on it. Right, so instead we're going to be looking at SSRIs, things along those lines. And given the high risk of suicide attempts by these patients, their use of medication in general is controversial, although again, if their team works in collaboration, medications can be very effective in combination with therapy. Alrighty, and now I have another Linehan video explaining goals in therapy here.
find it very important that therapists not set the goals of therapy, but clients set them. My job is to help clients achieve their goals. My job is not to figure out what goals a client should have. On the other hand, that once I know what their goals are, I'm paid to know how to get there. Okay, I tell my students all the time, you don't know how to get them there, don't treat them, because that's what we're supposed to know how to do. So I have to kind of know what the client wants. In general, as far as I know, cutting, trying to kill yourself, I don't know of any goals that clients have had that these are the behaviors that will get you there. If a client comes to me who's trying to kill themselves, I have to point out to them that if they kill themselves, therapy is not going to work. So we have to get them to agree not to kill themselves, at least for some period of time. Now, it may be, for the next 2 hours, or it could be till the next week. But the facts of the matter are therapy doesn't work with dead people. So they need to at least know that. I don't ask people to agree to never kill themselves. What I ask is, would they like a therapy that would help them build a life where they didn't want to kill themselves? Would that be a reasonable goal, to have a life where you don't want to kill yourself? And the average client wants that. I've never had someone come to therapy saying, I want help not killing myself. I've absolutely never had a client say that. That's because they don't believe that there could be a life where they wouldn't want to kill themselves. So I say, if that were possible, would you want it? Yes. Okay, fine. We'll do that.
So again, you kind of see how it differs from other therapies. And in fact, the dialectical and dialectical behavioral therapy is a recognition that two things that seem contradictory can exist at the same time. So like one of my favorites is the client can be trying as hard as they think they can. That doesn't mean they can't try harder, right? And so she's going to talk about why therapists don't treat this disorder.
The real problem with borderline personality disorder is there's no one who's going to dispute the fact that this is a group of people with severe disorders, complex disorders, and multiple diagnoses. Okay, that's very different than having a person who walks in with one disorder that you've got a evidence-based treatment for that takes 8 weeks that works. Okay, believe me, I've had it. I've had people come in, they say, I've got this disorder. I say, great, we've got this treatment. They say, great. I say, okay, do this. They say, okay, they do it that week, come back. They say, okay, that worked, what next? I say, do this, they do that. And then, at 10 weeks later, they're fine. They call me a year later and say, oh, I'm fabulous, thanks, da-da-da. Okay, this is not that. This is difficult, multiple diagnosis, complex disorders where when they're highly suicidal, you're at high risk, or you think you're at high risk. So a lot of people don't want to treat suicidal people. For one, they feel they might get sued if the person kills themselves, and unfortunately they might. They think, I'll have to take phone calls at home. I have 2 little kids. I don't want to do this. Or, why would I do that? Because you don't get any more money for treating a client that's difficult, that takes a lot more time, where you do take a lot of phone calls. You get no more money for that than you do for that previous client I was telling you about that's really easy. The only difference is one's long-term and one's short-term. Okay, so you get paid longer for the long-term and not as long for the other. But the point is that there's no incentive in the field to treat highly difficult clients. So therefore, you often find your most talented therapists can choose the clients they want. So they choose easy clients. And other therapists who don't have that kind of choice often end up treating the very severe. Sooner or later.
And so you can see, again, she's spot on. If I treated someone with depression, or I treated someone with bipolar or borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and an eating disorder, and a history of trauma, I'm going to get paid the same thing, right? And yeah, there's more liability. Yeah, it burns you out more quickly. Yeah, I would wake up in the middle of the night worried about my borderline PD clients, right? But there are people like Linehan who do this and do this very well. And I think that we need good people doing this. So if this is at all interesting to you, please consider getting, if you go to grad school, getting trained in doing this therapy and helping this clientele, because we need, there's a lot of people who do depression and anxiety. There are fewer for the stuff we're covering in the second half of the semester. There are few people who treat schizophrenia. There are few people who treat eating disorders. There are a few people who treat personality disorders because they're so tough. All right, so histrionic personality disorder. People with this disorder are extremely emotional and continuously seek to be the center of attention. They often engage in attention-getting behaviors. Approval and praise are their lifeblood. They can be described by others as vain, self-centered, and demanding. Sometimes they will engage in self-harm or parasuicidal behaviors to get attention specifically. So the reason they're doing it is different than borderline folks. People with borderline PD are doing it often to try to cope with the severe psychological pain they're experiencing. This disorder was once believed to be more common in women than men. However, not surprisingly, research has revealed a gender bias in diagnosis. And once we took that away, surprise, surprise, it's equal. Around 2% of adults have this personality disorder. Sociocultural theorists believe the disorder is caused in part by society's norms and expectation, that this vain, dramatic, and selfish behavior may be an exaggeration of femininity as defined by our culture. In terms of treatment, these folks do seek treatment for their disorder, and working with them can be difficult because of their demands, tantrums, sometimes seductiveness towards the therapist, and attempts to please the therapist. Cognitive therapists try to help people change the belief that they're helpless and try to help them develop better, more deliberate ways of solving problems on their own. Psychodynamic and group therapy have been applied. Clinical case reports suggest that each of these can be useful. Medication doesn't necessarily help here unless they have comorbid depression. All right, so just a brief little demo of what the
Welcome to a preview of a Symptom Media Continuing Education, a video streaming library of over 600 assessment tools, DSM-5 and ICD-10 guided case simulations. As a subscriber,
here we go.
We went on our second date last night, and I just don't know why he doesn't want to be with me. I mean, something's wrong. That's why I needed to see you.
What do you think is wrong?
Me? Me is what's wrong.
What's wrong with you?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like, oh God, I'm just so tired of being single. I was looking for romance, for marriage. Instead, I got chewy chicken and a cold date. I'm tired of being single. I mean, I think I'm sexy. I think I'm attractive. Why is life so difficult? I feel like Ophelia in Hamlet or the Virgin Mary. I'm a lost cause. I should have been born in the 1800s or the 40s. Hey, I could have been a jazz singer. Do-ah.
So one of the fair or not stereotypes of people with histrionic personality disorder is they're like musical theater majors. So you can see a little bit of that there. And then this is a little bit about treating histrionic PD.
What can you do about histrionic personality disorder? Like most of the personality disorders, because it's a part of your makeup, you don't usually seek help for the personality issues. If you develop depression and anxiety because of this, you could see a psychiatrist for possible medication treatment. To really get at the heart of changing your personality, you would have to recognize that the root of your problems with other people is your personality. And that's a hard step for most most people to get to. They're more likely to see their problems as caused by their circumstances. But if you choose to focus on changing yourself, you would need psychotherapy. And this could be psychoanalytically focused, cognitive behavior therapy, or interpersonal therapy. Dialectical behavior therapy is a variation of cognitive behavior therapy used for borderline personality disorder. And it may be a good choice because there is overlap between histrionic and borderline personality disorder, especially with the way it affects relationships.
And you could see that in that, these clips that I'm showing you from the one company, they're all actors, right? But you can see that in the, like, we went on our second date and I can't believe we're not together, right? So these relationships issues. Narcissistic PD is our last cluster B. People with this disorder are generally grandiose, need much admiration, and feel no empathy for others. They're convinced of their own great success, power, or beauty, and they expect constant attention and admiration from those around them. People with this disorder exaggerate their achievements and talents, and they often appear arrogant. People with this disorder seldom are interested in the feelings of others, and they can take advantage of others to achieve their own ends. This is rare, less than 1% of adults, and up to 75% of those diagnosed are men. And again, sort of calling back to what we talked about last week, we can't diagnose these disorders till someone hits 18. This one in particular, partially because this type of narcissistic behavior is actually really common among teens, at least in Western cultures that are very sort of individual centric. This disorder is one of the most difficult ones to treat. Clients who consult therapists typically do so because of a related disorder, depression, or sometimes anxiety is underlying this. And once in treatment, the individuals may try to manipulate the therapist in supporting their sense of superiority. And treatment here is really hard. None of the major treatment approaches have much success. I've only ever seen one person with this disorder. And I used, most of our supervisors would give us a pass, like one freebie, that if we felt we just weren't vibing with a client, we could, after the intake, pass them off to somebody else. And I used mine on this guy. Our intakes usually took about an hour. His was 3. I mean, he told me he was writing the next great American novel. He didn't have a single word on the page. And so he actually ended up being seen by one of our specialists in anxiety, because that's what was underlying what was going on with him. All right, and this again is an actress. So it gives you a little bit of a vibe of what this might look like.
That must feel good to travel to important places and meet a lot of important people.
Well, not exactly. I feel cut off from the rest of the world. When I accepted this promotion as Executive Secretary of Advertising, I thought it was going to be a major step upward for me.
Yeah?
Now I'm not sure why I accepted this promotion. I mean, they're obviously much too dim to realize that my suggestions are the first glimmer of genius this company has seen in years. On Tuesday, I pointed out to the board that a few minor changes in the new campaign could easily send sales soaring. Could they comprehend that? No. I mean, did they not realize that it was my vitality and my immaculate organizing abilities that pushed Estelle's to the top of the market? I think they're just too jealous to accept my ideas. Any other company would have absorbed them. They passed right over them.
So that, again, gives you a little bit of a vibe with maybe not the best actress. And for whatever reason, this short wouldn't let me link it in the thing.
The way you treat narcissism is basically to therapy. And also, if there are other aspects of the individual that develop as a result of the narcissism, such as suicidality, depression, anxiety, you treat that with an SSRI as well as a talk therapy. If there are issues of a history of PTSD and that led to the narcissism, things like DBT can help that, as well as having an eating disorder. So you have to look at the other comorbid diagnoses that may be associated with the person with the narcissistic personality disorder. So again, this is something that folks have
multiple things when they come to see you. The idea that narcissism might be part of our culture, right, is something that particularly boomers like to talk about. Alrighty, next we're going to talk about the cluster C, or the anxious personality disorders. And these include avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. People with these disorders typically display anxious and fearful behavior, although many of the symptoms are similar to those of anxiety and depressive disorders. Researchers have found no link between this cluster and those particular conditions, what we used to call Axis 1 conditions. And as with most of the personality disorders, research here is limited, but treatments for this cluster appear to be modestly to moderately helpful, and particularly therapies that usually help people with anxiety. So avoidant personality disorder is the extreme version of social anxiety in some ways. People with this disorders are very uncomfortable and inhibited in social situations, overwhelmed by feelings of inadequacy, and extremely sensitive to negative evaluation. They believe themselves unappealing or inferior, and often have few close friends. This disorder is similar to social anxiety, and people can be diagnosed with both. Similarities between the two disorders include a fear of humiliation and low self-confidence. A key difference that people with social phobia mainly fear social circumstances, but people with avoidant personality disorder tend to fear close social relationships. 1 to 2% of adults are diagnosed with this, men more frequently than women. People with this disorder come to therapy seeking acceptance and affection. Keeping them in therapy can be challenging because they'll begin to avoid sessions as the relationship between them and the therapist grows. So a key task of the therapist is to build trust. Beyond building trust, therapists tend to treat the disorder as they would treat social phobia and anxiety. There's modest success, and again, anti-anxiety drugs could be helpful here as well. So again, short here, I was finding lots of good shorts.
What is the relationship between
explaining the difference
avoidant
here.
personality disorder, AVPD, and social anxiety disorder, SAD? These disorders are similar. For quite some time, avoidant was actually conceptualized by many researchers as a more severe version of SAD. This is called the severity continuum hypothesis. This hypothesis has mostly been abandoned in favor of the idea that the two disorders are distinct constructs. Both disorders involve avoidance. The main difference between the disorders is connected with the motive for avoiding social situations. Fears of rejection and feelings of inadequacy motivate people with AVPD to avoid social situations. SAD is more focused on a fear of humiliation or embarrassment.
So again, nice little short.
What is
explains
the
some of
relation?
stuff. All right, dependent personality disorder. People with this disorder have a pervasive, excessive need to be taken care of by others. As a result, they tend to be clinging and obedient, and they fear separation from their loved ones. They rely on others so much they cannot make the smallest decisions for themselves. I had a client with dependent features. She was in her 40s, and her husband would give her a weekly allowance. Let's see. Many people with this disorder feel distressed, lonely, and sad. Often they dislike themselves. They're at risk for depression and anxiety disorders and may be prone to thoughts of suicide. Somewhere around 2 to 3% of folks, and men and women are affected equally. Cognitive theorists identify 2 maladaptive attitudes that produce and maintain this disorder. I'm inadequate and helpless to deal with this world. I must find a person to provide protection so I can cope. Such thinking prevents sufferers from making efforts to be autonomous or independent. In therapy, people with this disorder usually place all responsibility for their treatment on the clinician. So a key task is to help them accept some responsibility for themselves and their own care. Couple or family therapy can be helpful, and treatment in general can be at least modestly helpful. Psychodynamic therapy here would focus on similar issues to therapy for people with depression. Cognitive therapists will try to help clients challenge and change their assumptions of incompetence and hopelessness. Antidepressant drug therapy has been helpful when it's comorbid, and group therapy can be really helpful here because it provides clients the opportunity to receive support from a number of peers, and because group members can actually start to model that independent behavior for each other. So again, not the best actress, but a little vibe of what this might look like.
Jerry, I don't know what to do. No, serious, I don't know what to do. Well, there are two outfits here. One's red. One's kind of, you know, kind of olive green. I'm not sure exactly which one I should get. Why don't you come, you know, I'm at the mall. I'm at this shop. I'm at the, well, I'm in JCPenney. Yeah. Just come to the women's section and then just tell me which set looks better on me, okay? Okay, because
It's the idea of not being able to make even small decisions like that for yourself. All right, OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. People with this disorder are so preoccupied with order, perfection, and control that they lose all flexibility, openness, and efficiency. They set unrealistically and unreasonably high standards for themselves and others, and fearing a mistake, they might be afraid to make decisions. They tend to be rigid and stubborn, and they may have trouble expressing affection, and their relationships can be stiff and superficial. So I added, one of my first clients was a client with fairly severe OCPD, and she had a 2 strikes and you're out rule. Like if people messed up twice, they were out of her life, but I was like, that's not even how baseball works. One of the first assignments I gave her, she came in the next week and she said, I thought this was stupid, but I did it anyway. So you have to like have a thick skin as a therapist, right? And she would like, let's say she had done laundry that day and her roommates were like, hey, let's go out to dinner. She would not go out with her friends until her closet was organized by color and sleeve length. She could not allow herself to do so. 2 to 5% of the population has this disorder. White, educated, married, and employed individuals receive it more often. Men receive it twice as often as women, and many clinicians believe it may be related to OCD, but there's not a link in research. People with this disorder do not usually believe there's anything wrong with them. They're unlikely to seek treatment. The only reason my client came in is because one of her beloved uncles died, and so she came in for grief support, and then we sort of explored from there. And although drug therapy and behavioral therapy have been effective for OCD, people with this disorder respond better to psychodynamic or particularly cognitive therapy. I did cognitive therapy with this client and she did really well. The only problem was I started having to give her homework on colored paper because otherwise she would like white it out and do it over. It was like part of her OCPD. So it was like a little bit of exposure for her to make her do it without whiting it out. Okay, so these are really long scrolls. I'm gonna watch short clips from them, but this is a guy who has OCPD and is pretty open about it on the web. I found him last night and he's kind of hilarious.
I have OCPD and I'm an asshole. This is still sort of a serious video and sort of a serious question.
Okay.
This video is intended as a follow-up to my video, Does Society Accept Those with OCPD? So in order to figure out if I qualify, let's take a look at some definitions. Dictionary.com defines the word as someone mean or contemptible, and someone mean would be offensive, selfish, unaccommodating, nasty, and malicious. If we go the humorous route, Urban Dictionary defines it as an obnoxious, arrogant, self-centered male who women can't seem to get enough of, or alternately, the worst kind of person. So right off the bat, it ain't a good thing. So why as someone with OCPD would I just not deny it from the get-go and avoid even making a video like this? Glutton for punishment? Am I a masochist? Do I take pride in the idea that I may be defined as this? Well, there's a lot of reasons actually. If I am, but I don't want to be, then this video serves as sort of an apology. If I am, but I feel I wouldn't be if it weren't for the OCPD, then I can discuss how I want to change. Maybe I am some of the time and I want to explain why sometimes I can be and other times I'm not at all. Maybe I am and I'm using this video to be an even bigger one to a larger audience. Or conversely, maybe I'm not and I just have a poor self-image or a distorted view of myself. I could be something much worse or I could be something much better. This video itself might even be an attempt to get to the bottom of it. Let's take the definitions apart a little bit and I'll try and do some self-reflecting. So am I mean? The first word.
So he's gonna go into that in much more detail, but even just the way he's approaching this in terms of like very intellectually breaking things down, that's very OCPD. These are people who like to kind of avoid emotion by focusing in on intellectual.
I have OCPD. If you know.
The other ways OCPD are described are type A personality or Freud's anal retentive personality. All right, and so here he talks a little bit about treatment. I'm going to skip it for now just so we get through all the slides, but again, feel free to watch it later. Okay, so those are all the personality disorders, but we know that the personality disorders currently in the DSM are problematic. Otherwise, as I mentioned last week, we wouldn't have two versions of the personality disorders in the DSM, right? One of the issues is that these are in categories. When in reality, there's much evidence that personality disorders are on a continuum with what we would call normal personality, whatever the heck that is. Meaning they're just extreme versions of normal things all of us might have. There's so much comorbidity between the personality disorders, meaning that people who are diagnosed with one are commonly diagnosed with more than one. So this suggests that there may be actually fewer personality disorders that adequately account for the variation in symptoms. So the DSM may have too many personality disorders given these high rates of comorbidity. I think I remember reading that 60% of people who are diagnosed with personality disorders are diagnosed with two or more, or just like personality disorder otherwise specified. Diagnosing a personality disorder using the DSM criteria requires information that's hard for clinicians to obtain. So you need accurate information about how this individual treats other people. You need information about how they behave in a wide variety of situations, and information about how stable an individual's behaviors have been since childhood or adolescence. Now, for this reason, when I was in my training clinic, we were not allowed to diagnose anyone with a personality disorder until we'd done intake and seen them for at least 3 therapy sessions. Unfortunately, in the real world of managed care, you can't do that. In the managed care world, at the end of the intake interview, you have to have a diagnosis that you put on their sheet or insurance will not pay. So I think that's a huge disadvantage. There are also these gender biases that I've been kind of hinting at throughout our lecture. So some personality disorders seem to be more frequent or at least more frequently diagnosed in women. And these are things like histrionic, dependent, and borderline personality disorders. And theorists have argued that this occurs because these disorders are characterized by flamboyant behavior, emotionality, and dependence on others, which are all thought to be extreme versions of negative stereotypes about women's personalities. Whereas others are more frequently diagnosed in men, like antisocial, paranoid, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And the same theorists argue that these disorders are just representative of extreme versions of negative stereotypes of men's personalities, so that clinicians over-apply these diagnoses to men, but not to women. So being hostile, violent, controlling, for example. There's also lack of recognition that the expression of symptoms may vary amongst people of various genders because of what's socially acceptable and allowed in different behaviors. So the key example here is antisocial PD. The diagnostic criteria emphasizes overt signs of callous and cruel antisocial behavior, But women who have antisocial PD may be less likely than men to engage in overt antisocial behavior because of greater social sanctions against women for doing so. Instead, they may find more subtle ways to act out. There is something called relational aggression. The movie Mean Girls is the definition of relational aggression, the burn book, backstabbing, things like that. Covertly sabotaging people. This may be much more common in women with antisocial PD. They may also choose to act out against those who might have a harder time speaking up, since, for example, like their children. So the DSM diagnostic criteria might not be accurately describing women who have this diagnosis. Are there better ways to classify them then? The leading criticism of this approach is that the classification system is using these categories that serve to dichotomize personality profiles. You have it or you don't, right? Yes or no. This method doesn't allow for variations in symptom presentation, including failure to meet all the criteria necessary for a full diagnosis. Here we go. I have it in my notes. I was right. It's estimated that as many as 60% of clients with personality problems are not diagnosable with the current criteria. The DSM-5 criteria, which is really just the copy paste of DSM-4 criteria. Given such difficulties, many theorists now believe that these criteria for disorders actually differ more in degree than in type of dysfunction. Theorists have proposed that these disorders should be organized by severity of key traits or personality dimensions, rather than the presence or absence of specific traits. A growing number of theorists suggest that a dimensional approach to classifying personality pathology would much more accurately reflect the personality problems that we see in the wild, in actual people. All right, so this is what's in the appendix of the DSM, the alternate DSM personality model. So the general criteria for a personality disorder is moderate or greater impairment in personality or self or interpersonal functioning. One or more pathological personality traits. The impairments are relatively inflexible and pervasive across a broad range of personal and social situations. And the impairments are relatively stable across time, with onset of at least adolescence or early adulthood. So this would be characterized by typical/atypical functioning in each of the following areas. So for self, they're looking at identity. And identity is regulation of self states, coherence of a sense of time and personal history, ability to experience a unique self and to identify clear boundaries between yourself and others, and the capacity for self-reflection. And then self-direction is the establishment of internal standards for one behavior, coherence and meaningfulness of both short-term and life goals. So this goes back to what Linehan was talking about in terms of the goals. Interpersonal issues. These look at empathy, or the ability to mentalize or create an accurate models of another's thoughts. This is sometimes called theory of mind. And people with personality disorders, people with psychosis, people with autism spectrum disorders struggle with this more than other folks do. The capacity for appreciating others' experiences and the attention to range of others' perspective and understanding social causality. If I do something horrible to someone, they might not respond with. And then there's intimacy, which is the depth and duration of connection with others, tolerance and desire for closeness, reciprocity of regard and support, and its reflection in their interpersonal and social behavior. And then you look at severity. So 0 would just be no impairment. Okay. They have a unique identity. They have the capacity to understand and appreciate others' experiences. 1, some impairment. There may be some variation in self-states and interpersonal boundaries due to strong emotions. In terms of interpersonal, others may be seen as having unreasonable expectations or a wish for control. Moderate, the regulation of self states depends on context. There's an impaired capacity to think about internal experience. Interpersonal, there's a considerable inability to consider multiple points of view. And you might pay attention to the views of others, but only with respect to perceived self-relevance. Severe impairment, self states are poorly regulated and unstable, and accompanied by confusion or lack of continuity in personal history. Interpersonally, the ability to understand the thoughts, feelings, and behavior of other people is significantly limited. And then extreme impairment, for the self, there's a profound inability to think about one's own experience. And for interpersonal, the ability to consider and understand others' experience and motivation is significantly impaired, and attention to others' perspective is virtually absent. So using these basic ideas, the alternative DSM-5 model cuts down the 10 personality disorders to 6 and defines them with these traits that we just talked about. So we're keeping a lot of cluster B, basically. We've got antisocial, borderline, and narcissistic. We're keeping 2 from cluster A, avoidant and schizotypal. And then when we get to cluster C, we've only got OCPD. There's also another idea that maybe we just do away with those labels altogether. And we just do personality disorder trait specified, where you would have moderate or greater impairment in personality functioning as manifested by difficulties in 2 or more of these areas: identity, self-destruction, empathy, and intimacy that we discussed before. So for this, you would have to have 1 or more pathological personality trait domains or specific trait facets within domains, considering all of the following. So negative affectivity, the opposite here would be emotional stability. So this person would experience a wide range of negative emotions, and the behavioral and interpersonal manifestations of those experiences are what we would look at to see whether they were dysfunctional or not. Trait facets would be things like emotional lability, anxiousness, submissiveness, separation insecurity, pessimism, low self-esteem, guilt and shame, self-harm, depressivity, or suspiciousness. Yeah.
How would antagonism versus agreeableness work for the personality disorders where people with symptoms?
Good question. Yeah, I'll skip to that one. We'll pop back to detachment. Yeah. So here you're looking at, do they exhibit diverse manifestations of antipathy towards others, or are they, again, right, maybe too agreeable? And yeah, that's something to keep in mind, is that these are sort of on a continuum as well, right? So, and in fact, these are kind of based on the big 5 personality traits, if you learn those in other courses, right? Agreeableness is one of them. So the idea is, if we're thinking like the cluster B, right, you might have, I'm thinking antisocial PD in particular, might have things like callousness, manipulativeness, narcissism, hostility, aggression. But then you could also have people on the extreme other end of that, and that's such a good point. In terms of detachment, withdrawal from other people. So here you could see this in avoidant. Sorry, avoidant is a cluster C, not a cluster A. Sorry, I said that wrong before. You see this in some of the other disorders as well. Trait facets here are social withdrawal, social detachment, anhedonia, and intimacy avoidance. Disinhibition, diverse manifestations of being presence-oriented instead of future or past-oriented, so that behavior is driven by current internal and external stimuli rather than by learning from the past or considering future goals or consequences. So impulsivity, distractibility, recklessness, irresponsibility. Again, you definitely feel this in the cluster B's, right? And then psychoticism versus lucidity. This is a range of odd or unusual behaviors and cognitions. Again, gonna see this more in schizotypal, but it can show up in some of the other ones as well. Including both process, which would be perception, and content, which would be their beliefs. So trait facets here would be unusual perceptions, unusual beliefs, eccentricity, cognitive dysregulation, and dissociation premise. Now, I didn't talk about dissociation previously, but this is something we talked about with PTSD that can also happen with some of the personality disorders, particularly borderline PD, is that when you talk about things that are difficult for them to talk about, they seem like they do an extreme version of zoning out. To the point that sometimes it's hard to get them to like come back to the session with you. And you and the client can have to work out a way to bring them back together, whether that's like clapping their hands or gently placing your hand on their arm or something along those lines. And again, doing things that are comfortable and work for your clients and are not gonna be detrimental in any way to the therapeutic relationship. All right, we got through it all. So I will see you all a week from today, 11:30, this room for our group presentations. My guess is they'll take 1.5 hours max, and then we'll be done.